The 100-pound military working dog exploded through the emergency doors like something built specifically to destroy whatever was in front of it. Two technicians hit the floor. A tray of instruments crashed and skidded across the tile. The handler screamed commands that the animal simply ignored, straining at a leash that was losing the argument. 40 seconds of chaos, and then nothing. The dog stopped. Not because anyone subdued it, not because it tired, because a woman in stained scrubs crouched down, said three quiet words in a tone most people reserve for library conversations. And the animal that had just flattened two trained staff members walked directly to her and sat down like it was the most natural thing in the world. Nobody in that room knew what to make of what they'd just seen. They were about to find out. Before this story goes any further, if you've never been here before, hit that subscribe button right now because this channel runs stories that will keep you awake long after the screen goes dark. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all started. The Harwick Veterinary Medical Center sat at the edge of Del Monte, Colorado, where the foothills flattened out and the town ran out of ambition. It wasn't a bad facility. It wasn't a great one either. It occupied that honest middle ground where the equipment worked most of the time, the staff turnover ran high, and the parking lot always had at least two cars with expired tags. The kind of place that attracted people who were good at their jobs but had stopped expecting anyone to notice. Raina Taft had worked there for 6 years. She occupied a specific slot in the clinic's social architecture, the kind that gets filled by someone competent enough to keep the wheels turning, but not credentialed enough, in anyone's estimation, to drive. She was a licensed veterinary nurse, not a doctor. She handled post-op monitoring, wound care, medication protocols, pre-surgical prep. She updated charts with the kind of precision that went unacknowledged precisely because it never failed. She showed up early most days and left late on others, and the doctors she worked under had long since settled into treating her the way people treat furniture they've stopped seeing: present, functional, invisible. She was 38 years old, brown hair she kept pulled back so tight it looked like a deliberate inconvenience, a face that didn't advertise much, scrubs that had been through enough cycles to fade from navy to something closer to gray. The only thing about Raina Taft that nobody at Harwick knew, the only thing she had never mentioned in 6 years of working there, was what she'd done before. That information wasn't secret exactly. It just hadn't come up. She had never brought it up. The morning started the way most mornings did, with Dr. Philip Cass standing in the break room explaining something nobody had asked him to explain. He was the senior veterinarian on duty, a compact man in his mid-50s with the haircut of someone who'd had the same barber for 30 years and never questioned it. He was talking about a case coming in, a military working dog, a handler transporting the animal from Fort Calvert after the dog had been retired from service. Handler says the dog's been limping on and off for 2 weeks, Cass said, pouring coffee without looking at the mug. Probably soft tissue. We'll do a quick exam, take some films, send them home with anti-inflammatories. Raina was refilling a supply cart and didn't comment. She had learned, across 6 years, that her comments in these moments landed with the weight of something that could be waited out. "I'll need you on intake when they arrive," Cass added, finally glancing at her. "Standard stuff." "Sure," she said. The dog arrived 40 minutes later and Standard went out the window in the first 30 seconds. The handler came through the side entrance first, a man in his late 40s named Joel Garver, broad-shouldered, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself the way military people carry themselves, even when they've been out long enough to stop noticing. He had a thick scar along his left forearm that disappeared under his sleeve, and he moved with the slight forward lean of someone who'd spent years walking into things, rather than away from them. The leash in his hand was wrapped twice around his fist. The dog came in behind him and immediately wasn't fine. The animal, a Belgian Malinois designated Cairo, 8 years old, recently separated from active service, scanned the room in the way working dogs scan rooms, which is categorically different from the way pet dogs scan rooms. Working dogs are threat assessing, they're pattern matching, they clock exits, unfamiliar stimuli, sounds that don't fit, movements that read wrong. Cairo did all of this in about 2 seconds, and then did something that nobody in the room was prepared for. He lunged, not at Garver, away from him. The leash snapped tight, Garver went sideways, and Cairo hit the end of his lead with enough force that the intake counter shook. A technician named Bryce stumbled back into a cabinet. A tray of instruments Raina had just organized went across the floor in a long metallic slide. Someone shouted. Someone else got out of the way fast enough that they went down on one knee. Garver was pulling the dog back using his whole body weight, shouting commands, Cairo, Platz, Platz, and the dog was not obeying. Raina came around the corner of the supply cart. She moved at a normal pace, not running, not hesitating, just moving toward a problem the way someone moves toward something they recognize. She crouched when she was about 4 feet from the dog, dropping below his eye level. She waited 2 full seconds, completely still. Then she said, in a voice so level it barely carried across the room, Here, sits. Cairo stopped. He turned his head. He looked at her. Then he walked to her, still pulling Garver along but walking instead of lunging, and he sat, right in front of her, head slightly tilted, ears half back. The room was quiet for a moment. Garver stared at her. How did you... He didn't finish the sentence. Raina was already looking at the dog. Not at his face, at his left rear leg, at the way he'd shifted his weight slightly forward as he sat, compensating for something, at the angle of his hip, at the micro-tension in his flank that most people would have missed entirely. He's been masking this for a while, she said. Garver pulled himself upright. The vet at Calvert said it was probably a soft tissue strain, said he'd work it out. When did they clear him for retirement? 4 months ago. Full medical workup. Raina said nothing to that. She let Cairo sniff her hand. She ran her palm slowly along his left flank and felt the subtle flinch he tried to suppress, the way the muscle tightened a half-second before his face changed. Let's get him to exam room 2, she said. Garver followed her down the hall, and as they walked, he studied her with the expression of a man who had handed trust to an unexpected source and wasn't entirely sure how he felt about it. You a vet here? Nurse. He absorbed that. You work with dogs a lot? Some. She didn't elaborate. He didn't press. The dog walked between them, still favoring the left rear leg in a pattern that was subtle enough that you would miss it if you weren't looking for it. Raina was looking for it. In exam room 2, she conducted the intake assessment while Cairo stayed remarkably calm, which, she knew, had less to do with any particular skill on her part and more to do with the fact that working dogs who have been through difficult situations will sometimes settle around people who move and communicate in ways that match their training. She wasn't performing calm. She was calm. The dog noticed the difference. She was midway through her notes when Dr. Cass appeared in the doorway. He looked at the dog. He looked at Garver. He looked at Raina's intake sheet. I'll take it from here, he said. Raina handed over the chart without a word. She had already flagged 3 items she wanted him to look at: weight distribution on the left rear, hip rotation range, and a secondary observation about muscle wasting along the gluteal group on that same side. She had circled them. Cass glanced at the chart. He did not look at the circled items. He introduced himself to Garver, shook his hand, spoke to the dog in a slightly performative way that working dogs generally don't respond to, and proceeded with his own examination. Raina stayed in the corner because nobody told her to leave, and she hadn't found a reason to go. Looks like a muscle strain to me, Cass said, after about 4 minutes. Possibly some minor joint irritation. Given his age, not surprising. We'll get some films just to be thorough, but I think we're looking at rest and anti-inflammatories. Garver nodded. He trusted the doctor, which was the correct and sensible thing to do. Raina said, Can we add lateral hip views to the imaging order? Cass turned to look at her, just slightly. We'll start with the standard set. The weight distribution he's showing is consistent with, Thank you, Raina. The way he said it was not a thank you. It was a period at the end of a sentence. She recognized the punctuation. She had been on the receiving end of it before, not just here, not just from him, but in other rooms, other facilities, other situations where the territory of expertise had been staked out and her standing within it had been made clear. She said, Of course, and left the room. In the hallway, she wrote her own notes on a personal pad she kept in her left pocket, not on the chart, which wasn't hers to annotate anymore. She wrote down what she'd observed, the specific indicators, the timeline as Garver had described it, the flag she'd raised and the response she'd received. She dated it. She had a habit of dating everything. The standard imaging came back 40 minutes later, Cass reviewed it, called it unremarkable, and was halfway through writing the discharge instructions when Raina, who had pulled up the images on the secondary workstation on the other side of the room, said, without turning around, "There's a density change in the caudal acetabulum." Cass stopped writing. "Right side of the image, the left hip. There's a density irregularity that reads as a healing fracture line." Silence. She turned around. "We need the lateral views." Cass walked to the workstation. He stood beside her and looked at the screen. He looked at it for longer than he would have if he'd seen nothing. He ordered the lateral views. The lateral views came back 22 minutes later and confirmed what Raina had already known. Cairo had a significant fracture of the femoral head. Not a recent injury, not a strain. A fracture that had been forming, stressing, and partially healing over a period of months, with compensatory changes in the surrounding musculature that indicated the animal had been bearing pain and redistributing his weight across every step for a long time. He had been cleared for military retirement with this injury in place. Someone had missed it, or someone had known and said nothing. Cass stood at the workstation for a moment with an expression Raina had learned to read as the specific discomfort of a person who had been wrong in front of a witness. He recovered professionally. He turned to the hallway and called for Garver. Raina remained at this workstation and pulled up the imaging again. She looked at the fracture. She looked at the compensatory changes. She looked at the timeline of the injury against the timeline of Cairo's last official military veterinary clearance. The math didn't work. An injury this developed didn't appear in 6 weeks. The muscle wasting along the gluteal group, the degree of compensatory loading in the contralateral limb, the density changes. This was months of accumulated damage. It predated the clearance examination by a significant margin. She pulled up the pad from her pocket and wrote down the name of the contractor listed in Garver's paperwork. The organization that had conducted and certified Cairo's pre-retirement medical evaluation. Meridian Canine Assessment Services. She had seen that name before. Not here. Not at Harwick. Somewhere else, in a different context, a different time, a different version of her life that she had largely stopped discussing with anyone. She looked at the name for a moment. Then she wrote it down carefully, closed the pad, and went back to work. Garver did not take the news well, which was understandable. He took it the way people take news that sits at the intersection of anger and guilt, loudly at first, then very quietly, then with a lot of questions that had no good answers. 4 months, he said. He was sitting in the consultation room across from Cass, and Raina was in the doorway with his paperwork, close enough to hear without being invited to participate. "They cleared him 4 months ago. Full workup. I have the records." "I understand," Cass said. "He's been in pain for 4 months. Based on the imaging, possibly longer." Garver went quiet. He looked at Cairo, who was lying on the exam table with the specific stillness of an animal that had learned stillness as a survival strategy. He never showed it. "Working dogs often don't," Raina said. Both men looked at her. Garver was something that might have been gratitude. Cass was something more neutral. "They're trained to push through pain signals," she continued, "and they mirror the emotional state of their handler. If Garver wasn't alarmed, Cairo had reason to suppress the signals further. It takes a specific kind of observation to catch it when they're that good at masking." Garver stared at her for a moment. "How do you know that?" She handed him the paperwork. "Because I've worked with them before." She left the room before he could ask the next question. In the back hallway, she stood at the sink and washed her hands for longer than necessary, the way people do when they need a moment without making a moment. She was thinking about Meridian Canine Assessment Services. She was thinking about the fracture that predated the clearance. She was thinking about the fact that she had flagged similar inconsistencies before, in records from a different organization, in a different state years ago, and that those flags had disappeared into the machinery of a system that had very effective ways of making inconvenient observations go away. She dried her hands. She went back to her supply cart. The rest of the afternoon was ordinary. Cass scheduled Cairo for surgical consultation, which was the right call and would require a specialist. Garver signed the forms with the tight-jawed expression of a man making decisions he hadn't expected to have to make. 2 other cases came in and were handled and discharged. At 5:40, Raina collected her bag from her locker, nodded to the overnight tech, and walked to her car in the employee lot. She sat in the driver's seat for 3 minutes before she started the engine. She was thinking about the pad in her left pocket, about the name she'd written down, about the fact that she had a storage unit 15 minutes from this parking lot that contained, among other things, a fireproof filing cabinet with approximately 400 pages of documentation she had accumulated during a period of her life she rarely discussed. Reports, medical evaluations, flagged discrepancies, correspondence, dates, names, organization designations, and a chain of observations that nobody had ever asked to see. She started the car. She drove home. She did not go to the storage unit that night, but she thought about it. 3 days passed before Joel Garver came back. He appeared at the front desk at 9 in the morning without an appointment, and when the receptionist told him Cairo's case was being handled by Dr. Cass, he said he understood that, but he wanted to speak to the nurse who had been in the room during the examination. They found Raina in the back, running post-op vitals on a retriever named something she'd already forgotten. "He wants to talk to you," said the tech who delivered the message, with the specific inflection of someone conveying mildly surprising news. Garver was waiting in the consultation room they'd put him in. He had papers spread on the table, printouts, a manila folder, 2 handwritten pages. He stood when she came in, which she hadn't expected. "I pulled Cairo's military file," he said. "Everything I could get access to. The evaluations, the pre-retirement workup, all of it." He pushed the folder toward her. "I want you to look at something." She sat down across from him and opened the folder. The pre-retirement veterinary evaluation was on the second page, dated 8 months earlier, conducted by Meridian Canine Assessment Services. The findings were clean, joint health within normal parameters, no significant radiographic findings, cleared for civilian adoption or handler transfer, signed by a veterinary contractor named Dr. Alan Price. Raina read the document. She read it the way she read everything, systematically, without commentary, letting the details arrange themselves. She turned to the imaging results that had been appended to the evaluation. She looked at the views that had been taken. She looked at what had been documented. The lateral hip views were not in the file. She looked again. Standard views, 4 of them. No lateral hip views. "They didn't take the lateral imaging," she said. "Is that unusual? For a pre-retirement evaluation on an 8-year-old working dog with a physically demanding service record?" She set the folder down. "Yes." Garver leaned forward. "I talked to 2 other handlers this week. Guys I know from Calvert, different units, dogs retired through the same program in the last 18 months. I asked them to pull their dogs' evaluation files." He put his handwritten pages on top of the folder. "One dog was euthanized 6 months after retirement for what his handler was told was an aggressive bone disease that came out of nowhere. The other dog is at a clinic in New Mexico right now with a spinal injury that his new vet says has to be at least a year old." The room was quiet. "Both cleared by Meridian," Garver said. Raina looked at the handwritten pages. She looked at the names on them. She looked at the dates. Her expression didn't change, which was something she had practiced for a long time, because it was easier to think when your face wasn't advertising your conclusions. "I'm a nurse," she said. "I can look at records. I can give you my clinical observations. I can't investigate a federal contractor." "I know." He met her eyes. "But you recognized what every other person in this building missed in 2 minutes." She didn't respond to that. He said, "Cairo trusted you, and I spent 22 years learning that dog has better instincts than most people I've served with." He paused. "I'm asking you to help me figure out what happened to him, and maybe what happened to the others." She looked at the folder on the table. She thought about the filing cabinet in the storage unit, about the 400 pages she had never shown anyone, about the name that matched. She said, "I'll need to make a phone call first." She didn't tell him who she was calling. She left the room, walked to the far end of the back corridor, and pulled out her personal phone. She scrolled to a contact she hadn't used in 4 years. A name attached to a number she had never deleted, for reasons she had never fully articulated to herself. She pressed call. It rang 3 times. On the 4th ring, a woman answered with her last name only, Vance. Raina said, "It's Taft. I think I've got something you need to see." There was a pause on the other end, then, "How long has it been sitting?" "Parts of it? About 6 years?" She glanced back toward the consultation room where Garver was waiting. "The newest piece is 3 days old." Another pause. Longer. "Send me a location. I'll have someone there within 48 hours. The call ended. Raina stood in the back corridor for a moment. She put the phone in her pocket. She straightened her shoulders in the way of someone who has just made a decision they knew was coming, but waited to make until the right moment arrived. Then she walked back to the consultation room and sat down across from Joel Garver. "Tell me everything about the evaluation process," she said. "From the beginning, leave nothing out." Garver looked at her for a moment, studying her, the way he'd studied her the first day, trying to fit her into a category that made sense. "Who did you call?" She picked up the folder. "Someone who's been waiting for this information for a long time." She looked at him over the top of the page. "You said Cairo has better instincts than most people you've served with." "Yeah. So do I." She turned to the first page of the evaluation. "Now talk to me." He talked. She listened. Outside, in the parking lot, a car she hadn't seen before was pulling slowly into a space near the side entrance. A dark blue sedan with government plates and no markings of any kind. It had arrived 17 hours ahead of schedule. The sedan sat in the lot for 11 minutes before anyone got out. Raina noticed it through the narrow window at the end of the back corridor, the one that looked out over the employee parking area and the side entrance that most clients didn't know existed. She noticed it the way she noticed most things, without making it obvious that she was noticing. She kept her body angled toward the consultation room where Garver was still talking, still laying out the timeline of Cairo's service history and retirement process, still connecting the dots that she was already 3 steps ahead of. But her peripheral attention was on the sedan, on the stillness of it, on the fact that government plates in an unmarked vehicle in a veterinary clinic parking lot in Delmont, Colorado, at 9:40 in the morning was not a coincidence she was prepared to ignore. The door opened. A woman got out of the passenger side. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, dressed in a way that was deliberately nondescript. Dark jacket, dark pants, nothing that would register as notable from a distance. She moved with economy, the way people move when they've trained themselves out of unnecessary gestures. She looked at the building for exactly 2 seconds before walking toward the side entrance. Raina excused herself from the consultation room and intercepted her in the hallway. The woman stopped when she saw Raina coming. She didn't look surprised. "Taft." "Vance." Raina kept her voice level. "You said 48 hours. I said someone would be there within 48 hours. Special Agent Mara Vance allowed herself a small, tight expression that wasn't quite a smile. "I drove myself." They stood in the hallway for a moment, 6 years and several unspoken things between them. Vance looked the same as Raina remembered. Same angular face, same quality of attention that made you feel like you were being read rather than looked at. She had a faint scar along her jaw that was new, or maybe Raina had just forgotten it. "The filing cabinet," Vance said. "You still have it." "I still have it." "How much of it is relevant to what you called about?" Raina thought about the Meridian documents, about the evaluation on Cairo, about Garver's handwritten pages with the names of 2 other dogs. "I won't know until I cross-reference it, but the organization name matches something I flagged 6 years ago in a different context." Vance was quiet for a moment. "Walk me through what you have here first, then we'll talk about the cabinet." Raina walked her to the consultation room. Garver stood when they entered, automatic, ingrained, and then caught himself and sat back down with the expression of a man recalibrating. Vance introduced herself with 2 words and a credential that she didn't elaborate on, and Garver, to his credit, didn't ask her to. He handed her the folder without being asked. Vance read it the way Raina read things, methodically, without commentary. She turned pages slowly. When she got to the section with Garver's handwritten notes, she stopped. "These 2 other dogs," she said, "the names of the handlers." "Marcus Webb and Dana Stoll," Garver said. "Both retired out of Fort Calvert in the last 2 years. Webb's dog, Rook, was euthanized in April. Stoll's dog, Petra, is still alive, but barely." "Have you been in contact with them recently?" "Called both of them this week." "Don't call them again." Vance set the folder down. "Not about this. Not until I tell you it's safe to do so." Garver looked at her. "Why?" "Because if what I think is happening is actually happening, you calling people and asking questions about the same contractor is a pattern that someone may already be watching for." She said it without drama, as a statement of operational reality. "You're not being investigated, but this conversation stays in this room." Garver nodded slowly. He looked at Raina. She didn't return the look. Vance turned to her. "The storage unit. Can we access it today?" "I have a key." Then we need to go there before we do anything else. The storage unit was a 10 by 15 space at a facility called Mesa Vault on the south edge of Delmont. Raina had rented it 9 months after she'd left military service. When it had become clear to her that the records she'd accumulated were not going to be subpoenaed, not going to be reviewed, not going to be treated as anything other than the output of a nurse who had overstepped her role and needed to understand that, she had boxed everything, labeled everything, driven it to Mesa Vault, and paid the monthly fee with the specific determination of someone who doesn't know exactly why they're holding on to something, but is certain they should. She had not opened the cabinet in 2 years. It smelled like cold metal and old paper when she pulled the roll door up. Vance's partner, a younger man named Aldez, who had gotten out of the driver's side of the sedan and hadn't said more than 4 words total, swept the unit with a light and then stood at the entrance with his hands in his pockets, watching the parking lot. The filing cabinet was in the back left corner, under a moving blanket. Raina pulled the blanket off, unlocked the cabinet with a key from her keychain, and opened the top drawer. 47 manila folders, tabbed and labeled in her handwriting. Dates running from 7 years ago through 6 years ago, the span of her last 18 months of active military service and the 3 months after her separation that she'd spent trying unsuccessfully to get someone to take the folders seriously. Vance pulled on gloves before she touched anything. "What's the organizational focus?" she asked. "The top 2 drawers are evaluations," Raina said. "Specifically, pre-deployment and pre-retirement medical clearances for military working dogs across 3 different installation veterinary programs. The 3rd drawer is correspondence, my written reports, the responses I received, and the documentation of what happened after I submitted them." Which was? Nothing. And then I was reassigned. And then my enlistment ended and nobody asked me to re-up, which I took as an answer. Vance was already moving through the top drawer reading tab labels. Meridian Canine Assessment Services. They're in here. Folder 17 and folder 23. Vance pulled both folders and stood at the cabinet reading. Raina watched her read. She watched the quality of Vance's attention shift, the slight stillness that came over her face when something landed that she hadn't expected. "These are evaluation discrepancies," Vance said without looking up. "You documented 17 separate cases where the Meridian clearance findings didn't match the clinical presentation on subsequent examination." 18. "I found an 18th case 2 weeks before I submitted the report, and it's handwritten on the inside cover of folder 23. Vance found it. She read it. "And this was all submitted to Colonel Douglas Farron, Installation Command. He forwarded it to his superior for review." Raina paused. "That was the last I heard of it officially. The informal response came 3 weeks later when I was reassigned to an administrative support role that had nothing to do with my training and had previously been handled by a specialist 2 grades below me." Who was Farron's superior at that time? Raina had known this question was coming. She had known it from the moment she had recognized the Meridian name on Cairo's paperwork. Brigadier General Court Welling. He was commanding the Medical Contracting Oversight Division at the time. Vance looked up from the folder. "Welling retired 4 months ago." "I know. He's currently serving as an advisory board member for 3 private defense contractors." "I didn't know that part." Raina held her expression. "But I'm not surprised." The storage unit was quiet except for the sound of pages turning, and distantly, a truck moving through the facility's main lane. Aldez shifted his weight at the entrance but didn't turn around. Vance worked through both folders with complete focus, and Raina stood to the side and let her, because she understood that what was happening right now needed to happen at Vance's pace and not hers. After 20 minutes, Vance closed the second folder and looked at the cabinet. "I need all of this." "I know. Chain of custody matters. I'll need you to sign a transfer documentation." "I have a notarized inventory list in the bottom drawer. I made it when I packed everything. Dates and descriptions of every item." Vance looked at her then, a different kind of look, more direct. "You prepared for this." "I prepared for the possibility," Raina said. "I wasn't sure the possibility would arrive. Most people in your position would have shredded everything after the reassignment." "I know." She had thought about it, more than once, across more than one bad night. "But I kept seeing the dogs." Vance absorbed that. Then she turned back to the cabinet and began the process of properly cataloging for transfer, moving with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work many times and knew better than to rush it. They were back at Harwick by early afternoon. Vance wanted to speak to Dr. Cass, not because he was implicated in anything, but because she needed to understand the full scope of what Cairo's imaging revealed and what the clinical timeline looked like from a veterinary standpoint. Cass was pulled out of a post-surgical consult to speak with her and came into the conference room with the expression of a man who had been interrupted and was attempting to manage his irritation professionally. He managed it for about 4 minutes. "I don't understand what this has to do with us," he said, after Vance had outlined, in the careful, non-specific language of an active investigation, what she was looking at. "The dog was brought here with a limb issue. We identified a fracture. That's a clinical matter. The clearance that missed the fracture is a federal contracting matter," Vance said. "Harwick may be the point where that fracture became officially undeniable. Your imaging records and the clinical notes from this case may be entered as evidence." Cass looked at the table. He looked at Raina, who was sitting at the far end of the conference room with her hands folded, having been invited to this meeting by Vance over the implicit sense that she probably shouldn't have been. "The notes from this case," he said. "The initial assessment flagged the hip issue before He stopped. "Before the standard imaging," Vance said neutrally. "Yes. Those notes are part of the clinical record." Cass was quiet for a moment. "I was doing the math that any reasonable person would do in that situation, recalling the circled items on Raina's intake sheet, the lateral imaging request he'd overridden, the sequence of events that had led to the correct diagnosis, and arriving at the conclusion of what that sequence looked like in documentation." "I see," he said finally. "We appreciate your cooperation," Vance said, in the tone that meant the conversation was functionally over. After Cass left, Vance didn't immediately say anything. She made a note on the small leather pad she kept in her jacket pocket. Raina waited. "He's going to be uncomfortable," Raina said. "People usually are." Vance capped her pen. "That's not your problem to manage." "I know." She did know. She had spent a portion of her career managing other people's discomfort with the facts she'd presented to them, and she had decided sometime around year 3 of doing it that this was an inefficient use of her energy. Vance set the pen down and looked at her directly. "I need to tell you something before this goes further, because you should hear it from me rather than discover it during the process." She paused. "The investigation I'm running is not new. Meridian Canine Assessment Services has been on a federal watch list for 14 months. We've been building a financial case, payments, contracts, billing irregularities, but we didn't have the clinical documentation to connect the billing to actual fraudulent evaluations." She indicated, with a slight movement of her hand, the direction of Mesa Vault. "What you have in that cabinet connects it." Raina said nothing for a moment. "You've been building this for 14 months. "Yes." "And the dogs that were cleared in the interim." Vance's jaw tightened. It was the first time her expression had moved outside its professional register. "We know. We've been working as fast as we can work without compromising the case." "How many?" Vance looked at her. She considered the question for a moment, calculating perhaps what information was appropriate to share with a cooperating witness versus what was operationally sensitive. Then she seemed to decide that Raina had earned a straight answer. 11 retired canines have died in the last 18 months. Causes officially listed as natural or age-related decline. Based on what we know about the fraudulent clearances, at least some of those deaths are likely attributable to undiagnosed and untreated injuries. She let that sit. "We don't have the forensic veterinary evidence to confirm it yet, but we're working on it." 11. Raina sat with that number. She had known, somewhere in the back of her awareness, that the scale of what she was looking at was larger than Cairo. She had known it from the moment Garver had shown up with his handwritten pages. But knowing a thing abstractly and having it stated in plain language by a federal investigator were different experiences. "What do you need from me?" she said, specifically. "Your testimony about what you observed clinically with Cairo, your documentation from the storage unit, which we're already processing, and—" Vance paused. "Your cooperation in what may become a more active investigative role, depending on how the next 72 hours develop." "What happens in the next 72 hours? "We serve the documentation request on Meridian. When that happens, the director of the organization will know the investigation has moved into a formal phase." She held Raina's gaze. "He'll also know because the documents will reference Harwick Veterinary Medical Center in the Cairo case that the clinical identification that triggered the formal case came from here. Raina understood what that meant. He'll know someone here flagged it. Yes. And if he pulls the intake records, he'll know which staff member conducted the initial assessment. It's possible. Vance said it without apology because she wasn't in a position to offer one. I want you to be aware of that before we proceed. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the thin wall, Raina could hear the ordinary sounds of the clinic continuing. Someone rolling a cart, a phone ringing at the front desk, one of the overnight dogs starting a low sustained vocalization that meant it was time for medication. Tell me about the director, Raina said. Vance opened her notepad to a specific page. Marcus Durrell, 61 years old, veterinary background, board certified, ran a legitimate practice for 14 years before establishing Meridian as a government contracting entity 9 years ago. He has significant connections inside military procurement, not just working dog programs, not just veterinary services, broader infrastructure. She looked at the page without reading from it. He's careful. He doesn't do the evaluations himself. He signs off on them. The veterinary contractor who performs the actual assessments is a woman named Dr. Rita Farrow, operating under his license and his company structure. She closed the pad. Farrow may be complicit. She may be coerced. We don't have clarity on that yet. And who protects Meridian from inside the system? It wasn't quite a question. Vance heard the shape of it. That's what the next 72 hours are going to tell us. The documentation request was served on Meridian Canine Assessment Services at 9 the following morning. Raina was at work when it happened, and she didn't know the exact moment it occurred. She knew only that it had been scheduled, and that she went through the morning with the particular awareness of someone waiting for a distant event to register on local instruments. The event registered at 11:17 in the form of a call to the Harwick front desk, asking for the veterinarian in charge of the Cairo case. The receptionist, a 24-year-old named Tessa, who took her job seriously and had been briefed by Vance's team not to route any case-specific calls to voicemail, flagged the call and put it through to the conference room, where Vance had established a temporary working presence with a laptop and 2 phones, and a calm that Raina was beginning to understand was less a personality trait than a professional instrument. Vance took the call. It lasted 3 minutes. She said almost nothing, questions in 1-word or 2-word forms, responses limited to "I understand" and "that will be noted." When she ended the call, she set the phone down and wrote 1 line in her notepad. She showed it to Raina when she came in at the end of the hall's midday quiet period. He knows who found the fracture. Raina read it. She handed the pad back. Farrow pulled the evaluation file and connected the dots. Or someone connected them for her. Vance set the pad on the table. Either way, Durrell knows your name is attached to the Cairo intake assessment. What does he do with that? That's what I'm watching. She picked up the other phone. Go back to work. Don't change your routine. If anyone contacts you about this case through any channel that isn't me, you call me before you respond. Raina went back to work. She ran afternoon medication rounds. She assisted with a wound flush on a terrier mix that had gotten into something it shouldn't have. She updated 3 charts, reordered 2 supply items, and ate a sandwich standing at the break room counter at 2:15 because she had forgotten to eat at noon. At 4:40, she was finishing the afternoon vitals check on a post-surgical patient in the recovery ward when Garver appeared in the doorway. He looked different than he had that morning. Not worse, exactly. Tighter, like something had compressed him slightly. "I got a call," he said. She set down the chart. "From who?" "Someone who said they were from Meridian. Said they wanted to discuss a possible administrative error in Cairo's evaluation file, and that they'd be happy to cover any additional veterinary costs that resulted from the error." He paused. "They asked me not to discuss the case with anyone while the administrative review was underway." "What did you say?" "I said I'd call them back." He looked at her. "Then I came here." She picked up her personal phone and called Vance. Vance answered on the first ring and asked Garver 3 questions in sequence. The exact time of the call, the number it came from, and word for word what the caller had said about the administrative review. She asked him to write down every detail he could remember and to forward the number to her immediately. She told him he was not to return the call. "They're closing the loop," Vance said to Raina while Garver was writing. making sure the witness who initiated the clinical discovery is neutralized before the documentation request can be actioned. They called him fast. They had to. The documentation request goes to a federal review panel in 36 hours. Her voice was completely even. They're trying to make Cairo's case look like a billing error before it can become part of a federal fraud proceeding. Raina looked at Garver, who was writing with the focused expression of a man who had been told his contribution mattered and was taking the instructions seriously. He won't take the offer. I know he won't. Vance paused. But there are 8 other current Meridian cases connected to the same contracting cycle. I don't know yet which of those handlers might take a call like that less well. Raina said nothing. Get him to forward the number, Vance said, and stay where you are until I call you. She ended the call. Garver looked up from his notes. What now? Now we wait, she said. He didn't like that. She didn't blame him. He had the temperament of a man who had spent decades in roles where waiting meant someone was getting hurt. But he nodded, folded his notes, and handed them to her. You're going to tell me what's actually going on at some point. When I can. That means you know more than you're saying. I usually do, she said, without any particular edge on it. Just a fact. He held her gaze for a moment. The first day, when Cairo walked up to you. He seemed to be working toward something. You'd been around working dogs before, a lot, not just a little. Yes. Military? She looked at him steadily. For a while. He nodded slowly. And the woman with the government plates. Someone I knew from that time. He let the silence run for a moment. Then, I'm not going to stop asking questions. I know, she said, but right now the questions that matter are the ones being asked by people with subpoena authority. He went quiet. He accepted that, in the way that military people sometimes accept information hierarchy, not without frustration, but with the understanding that the hierarchy exists for operational reasons. She walked him out through the side entrance and stood in the parking lot while he drove away. The evening was starting to pull color out of the sky, the kind of Colorado dusk that went quickly from orange to gray without much ceremony. Vance appeared at the side door behind her. We have a problem. Raina turned. The financial forensics team ran the contracting payment chain for Meridian. Vance's voice was as measured as it always was, but something underneath it had changed, a frequency shift that Raina recognized as significance. The payments from the Department of Defense don't go directly to Meridian's primary business account. They route through a sub-entity. What kind of sub-entity? A shell company, registered in Delaware, dormant for most purposes. She paused. Except it has one active connection. A consulting payment structure that distributes a portion of every Meridian government contract to an individual recipient. The parking lot was quiet. Somewhere in the facility, a dog had started barking, persistent, rhythmic, the kind of bark that was more habit than alarm. The recipient, Raina said. We're still confirming the full chain, but the preliminary trace points to a name inside the Military Procurement Authority. Vance looked at her directly. Specifically to the individual who held oversight authority for the contracting division that approved Meridian's initial government certification. Raina went very still. She knew, before Vance said it, approximately what the name was going to be. She knew it the way she had known about Cairo's hip, not through certainty, not yet, but through the specific accumulation of detail that pointed in one direction and had been pointing there since the moment she had seen Meridian's name on a piece of paper 3 days ago. Welling, she said. Vance looked at her for one long moment. No, she said. Not Welling. She glanced toward the building, then back. Welling is adjacent. The payments go to a person who served under Welling's command during the period when your original reports were submitted and buried. The barking inside had stopped. A person who had direct access to your reports, Vance continued, who would have seen the Meridian discrepancies you flagged, who made the decision about how to respond to them. Raina's voice was completely flat. Farran. Colonel Douglas Farran. Vance let the name sit. He didn't just forward your report and forget about it. He buried it because he was already receiving payments to bury exactly that kind of report. She paused. He's been doing it for 6 years, possibly longer, and the payment chain that connects him to Meridian. She stopped. What? Ran its last transaction 4 days ago. Vance's expression was controlled, but her eyes were precise. 2 days after Cairo walked into your clinic. The meaning of the timing settled over Raina like temperature change. Not a shock, but something that moved through her completely. Someone had paid Farhan after Cairo's case was identified. Not before. After. Which meant someone had already known about Cairo's case within 48 hours of the intake. Which meant someone at Harwick, or someone connected to someone at Harwick, had communicated with Meridian before Raina had made her call to Vance. She looked at the building, at the lit windows, at the ordinary movements of staff she had worked alongside for 6 years. "You need to tell me," she said carefully, "who made that communication." Vance's jaw was set. "We're working on it. Because if someone in this building is connected to Meridian, I know." Vance's voice was sharp for the first time. Not angry, sharp. "I know what it means, and I need you to go back inside, behave exactly as you have been, and let my team do what my team does." Raina stood in the parking lot for one more second. She looked at the side entrance, at the door she had walked in and out of 1,000 times, at the ordinary, unremarkable building that had just become something else. She went back inside. She returned to the recovery ward and finished the vitals she had left half done. She updated the chart with hands that were steady because she made them steady. She moved through the rest of the evening with the practiced composure of someone who had learned, across years of doing difficult things in difficult places, that falling apart was a decision, and so was its opposite. At 8:15, her personal phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. No name, 11 words. "You should have destroyed those records when you had the chance." She read the message twice. Then she screenshotted it, forwarded it to Vance's number, and put the phone face down on the supply cart beside her. Her hands were still steady. She noticed that about herself without particular pride. It was simply information, the same way a patient's pulse was information. Something to note and factor in. Vance called back in 4 minutes. "Don't respond to it," she said before Raina could speak. "I wasn't going to. The number is a burner. We're already on it." A pause, and in the background Raina could hear the specific ambient sound of a room with multiple people working quietly. Keyboards, low voices, the particular density of concentrated effort. "Are you somewhere private?" Raina looked at the recovery ward around her. One dog sleeping off anesthesia. No staff. "Yes." "The message tells us something useful. Whoever sent it knows about the records but doesn't know we already have them. They're trying to create a window, convince you to destroy evidence before the documentation request completes processing." Vance's voice was precise. "Which means they don't have someone inside the federal process. They have someone adjacent to it." "Or they have someone here," Raina said, "in this building." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 1 beat too long. "You already know who it is," Raina said. "I have a strong preliminary indicator. I'm not going to confirm it until I have something that holds in a federal proceeding." Vance's voice shifted slightly, not softer, but more direct. "I need you to do something that's going to feel counterintuitive. Tell me. Come in tomorrow at your normal time. Behave normally. If the person I'm looking at is going to move, they'll move in the next 18 to 24 hours because the documentation request deadline is tomorrow at 5. I need them to believe the situation is still in their control." "You're using me as a fixed point," Raina said. "Not an accusation, just the accurate name for the thing." "You're already a fixed point. I'm asking you to stay still." She said she would. She ended the call. She finished the vitals chart, completed the evening handoff notes, and drove home in the dark along a route she had driven so many times it required almost no conscious navigation, which left her mind free to work on the geometry of what she knew. Someone at Harwick had communicated with Meridian within 48 hours of Cairo's intake. The payment to Farhan had run 4 days ago, 2 days after the case. The message tonight came from someone who knew about the storage unit records, but didn't know they'd already been transferred. That combination of knowledge, knowing about the records, knowing about the case, not knowing about the federal transfer, described a person with internal access and external connections, but no visibility into what Vance's team had actually done. She thought about who at Harwick had been present during Cairo's initial assessment, who had been in the building, who had access to intake records without requiring special authorization. She thought about Cass, reviewing imaging files at the primary workstation with full administrator access to the case management system. She thought about how quickly Meridian had called Garver. She did not sleep well. This was not unusual for her, so she did not treat it as significant. She lay in the dark and let her mind work until it stopped finding new angles. And then she got up at 5:40 and made coffee and drove to Harwick in the gray pre-dawn light. The morning started quietly, and quiet mornings at Harwick had a specific texture, a kind of provisional calm, the way a held breath feels different from a resting one. Raina moved through her opening tasks with the deliberate normalcy of someone performing normalcy as an act of will. She restocked the supply cart. She ran the morning vitals on the overnight patients. She updated the handoff notes from the previous shift, noting 2 items that needed follow-up, dating and initialing everything with the consistency she had maintained for 6 years, regardless of what else was happening. At 8:50, Vance texted a single word: confirmed. Raina read it at the supply station and put the phone back in her pocket without changing her expression. 11 minutes later, Dr. Cass called in sick. The receptionist announced it at the morning briefing with the slightly frazzled energy of someone who had just been handed an administrative problem before 9 in the morning. The on-call veterinarian, Dr. Amara Bledsoe, would cover. Raina noted the timing. She noted it the way she noted Cairo's weight distribution, without flagging it externally, letting it settle into the larger pattern she was assembling. At 9:30, 2 people she didn't recognize came through the front entrance and asked for the clinic administrator. They were shown to the back office. They were in there for 40 minutes. When they came out, one of them handed something to the receptionist and the other one walked directly to the records room. Raina was in the medication dispensary 12 feet from the records room door when it opened, and she kept her back to it, counting tablets into a dosage tray. One of Vance's people appeared at the dispensary window. "She wants you in this conference room when you have a clean stopping point." She finished counting the tablets, logged the dispensation, and went to the conference room. Vance was standing at the far end with 2 members of her team. On the table was a printed document, several pages, held together with a binder clip. Vance slid it across the table without preamble. "Federal Archive," she said, "specifically the Military Veterinary Records Division, which stores official documentation for all active and retired military working dogs. This was filed there 72 hours ago." She tapped the top page. "Read the signatory line." Raina read it, her own name. "Clinical evaluation conducted and certified by R. Taft, Veterinary Nurse Specialist, Meridian Canine Assessment Services." The document was a pre-retirement clearance for a dog named Lancer, dated 14 months ago. It cleared the animal for transfer with no significant findings. It bore what appeared to be her signature, her former military service number, and a certification stamp from Meridian. 14 months ago, Raina had been working at Harwick. She had never worked for Meridian. She had never examined a dog named Lancer. She had never been to whatever facility this document claimed the evaluation had taken place. She set the document down. "Forgery," she said, "an extremely competent one." Vance sat down across from her. "The service number is accurate. The formatting matches legitimate documentation from your military service period. Someone had access to your records, your real records, and used them to construct a credible-looking document that, if it holds, makes you a Meridian employee who falsified a military evaluation. Turning me into the suspect, turning the whistleblower into the perpetrator. Yes." Vance's voice was completely controlled. "The document was filed in the Federal Archive with a timestamp that predates your contact with me, which means, on paper, you were conducting fraudulent evaluations for Meridian while simultaneously maintaining records to implicate them." Raina absorbed the architecture of it. It was, she had to concede, well-constructed, ugly and specific and well-constructed. Who filed it? That's the question we're inside right now. Vance leaned forward slightly. The filing was submitted through an electronic portal that requires federal contractor credentials to access. We have the IP origin of the submission. We have the timestamp. We have the credential chain. She paused. The credential chain traces back to a contractor access account registered to Meridian, but that's a blind. Someone used Meridian's access deliberately to obscure the origin. She looked at Raina directly. The forensic team is reconstructing the actual submission path. They're close. How close? Hours. Raina looked at the document again. At her own name in a font she hadn't typed and a signature she hadn't written. She thought about what this document would have looked like to a federal investigator who didn't already have 400 pages of her meticulous records, who didn't know about the storage unit, who had come across this filing in isolation. It would have been damning. It would have been the end of everything she'd preserved across 6 years of waiting for the right moment. "The dog," she said. "Lancer. Is he alive?" Vance's expression moved, just slightly. "We're locating him," which meant they didn't know yet, which meant another dog in an unknown condition somewhere. Someone had put its name on a piece of paper as a tool for burying a human being. She pushed back from the table. "What do you need from me right now?" "Your cooperation with the forensic timeline. I need you to document, formally, your whereabouts on the date of this evaluation, 14 months ago." She slid a blank form across the table. "Anything you can verify, time cards, purchase records, communications, anything with a timestamp that places you at Harwick on that date and not at the facility listed in this document." Raina looked at the form. "I keep a personal log, handwritten. Every workday since I started here, patient interactions, timing notes, anything I think is worth recording." She paused. "I have it with me." Vance looked at her for a moment. "Of course you do." "I keep it in my locker." She stood up. "Give me 3 minutes." The log covered 14 months ago in 2 pages of dense, dated entries. Raina had worked a full shift that day. She could verify it against the time card records the federal team was already pulling from Harwick's payroll system. She had been present for a complicated post-surgical case that had run 4 hours past her scheduled end time. She had eaten in the break room at 6:15. She had spoken to Bledsoe about a medication interaction concern and logged the conversation. She handed the log to Vance and watched her read it. "This is enough," Vance said. "Combined with the payroll records, this demolishes the document's timeline." "Good. The person who filed this didn't know about the log." "Nobody knew about the log," Raina said. "I've never mentioned it to anyone here." Vance looked at her with the steady, measuring attention that Raina had come to understand was how she expressed something adjacent to respect. "You've been building a case for 6 years without knowing whether anyone would ever ask to see it." "I've been recording what I observed," Raina said. "What other people did with that was always going to be their decision." Vance set the log down carefully. "The forensic team just flagged something." She was reading her phone. Her expression didn't change, but her posture did, a slight forward shift like a person leaning into wind. "The submission path on the forged document, they've reconstructed it." Raina waited. "It doesn't go to Farron." Vance set the phone face down. "Farron received the payment. He didn't file the document." She looked at Raina steadily. "The submission traces to a system access point registered to a specific military contracting authority, someone with current federal access and active credentials." "Who?" "Brigadier General Court Welling." She said it without particular inflection. "He retained advisory access to the federal archive system when he transitioned to private consulting. The access should have been terminated upon his departure. It wasn't." Her jaw tightened. "Someone didn't close the door." "Welling." Not just adjacent, as Vance had said the previous evening. Welling, who had received Farron's forwarded report 6 years ago. Welling, who had allowed her warnings about Meridian to disappear into administrative silence. Welling, who had retired 4 months ago and taken a seat on advisory boards and apparently taken his federal archive credentials with him. "He filed it himself," Raina said. "He didn't delegate it." "Which means he's more directly exposed than we anticipated." Vance was already on her phone. "And it means the document was filed in a panic. Something triggered it in the last 72 hours. Cairo's case going into the federal review process." "Yes. Someone told Welling it was moving. He scrambled to create a preemptive defense." She was typing as she spoke. "Which tells us he doesn't know we've already transferred your storage records. He thinks the forged document can still reframe the narrative." She looked up. "It cannot." In the hallway outside the conference room, someone's radio crackled. Footsteps moved past the door in the quick, purposeful rhythm of people with somewhere urgent to be. Raina heard it and stayed where she was, because staying where she was had been the instruction, and she had been following instructions like this for long enough to understand that the discipline of staying in position was not passivity. It was the hardest kind of operational self-control. At 11:40, Vance's phone rang. She answered it, listened for 40 seconds without speaking, and ended the call. "Meridian's director is at the facility," she said. "Marcus Durrell drove to the Meridian offices this morning at 7:15 and hasn't left. He's been on his private cell for most of the morning." She stood. He's going to run. The documentation deadline is in 5 hours, and he knows the financial records are already in our hands. He's making arrangements. What kind of arrangements? The kind that require a passport and a very early departure from the country. She was pulling on her jacket. We're moving now. Raina stood. What do you need from me? Stay here. Don't take calls from unknown numbers. If Cass comes back in, act normally. She was already at the door. And Raina. She paused. The document, the forged clearance with your name on it. I want you to understand something. It was sophisticated enough that it would have worked against almost anyone else. Against someone who didn't keep daily logs, who didn't have a notarized storage inventory, who hadn't been this precise for this long. She held Raina's gaze. They targeted you specifically because you were the most dangerous witness they could imagine, which is its own kind of answer. She left. Her team went with her. The conference room was quiet. Raina stood at the table alone for a moment. She looked at the forged document, which Vance's team had taken a copy of and left the copy behind. She looked at her own name, rendered in someone else's intention, on a piece of paper designed to destroy 6 years of careful truth-keeping. She turned it face down and went back to work. The afternoon moved with the grinding slowness of high-stakes waiting, which was its own kind of endurance event. Raina covered for the absent Cass without being asked. Bledsoe was handling the surgical cases, and the overflow hit the nursing staff, which meant Raina was running harder than usual, which was perhaps a mercy. There was less room for the mind to wander when the body was occupied. At 2:10, Vance called. Durrell is in custody. The background noise had changed, outdoor sounds now, wind, the distant mechanical noise of vehicles. He was 60 feet from his car in the parking garage adjacent to Meridian's facility, with a bag that contained, among other things, a passport and approximately $40,000 in mixed currency. She paused. He said nothing when we arrested him, not one word. He just looked at the bag and then looked at us and then looked at the ground. Did he run? He tried to walk very calmly toward a service exit. The calmness was the tell. Another pause. His attorney was called from the back of the vehicle before we reached the field office. Extremely fast. Prearranged. He'd been planning this for a while. For at least 2 weeks, based on what we found in the bag. The Cairo case accelerated the timeline, but the exit plan was already in place. She sounded like someone who had seen this before and found it neither surprising nor satisfying. Farrow, the veterinary contractor who conducted the actual evaluations, she was at the facility when we arrived. She sat down in the parking lot and started crying before we said a word to her. A beat. She's going to cooperate. And Welling. A longer pause. Welling is... We're having some difficulty locating him this afternoon. Raina went still. He's not at his registered address. Not at either of his advisory board offices. His personal vehicle is at his home, which tells us either he left another way or he's still in the residence and not answering. Vance's voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it now, the specific tension of a situation that hadn't resolved cleanly. We have agents at the location. We'll have clarity within the hour. He knows you're coming. He may. The Durrell arrest moves fast through certain circles. She paused. I want you to be aware that with Durrell in custody and Welling's location unconfirmed, the immediate pressure on you is reduced. But until Welling is accounted for, I'd like you to avoid being alone outside the building. I understand. I mean it, Raina. He filed that document himself. He's not operating through intermediaries at this point, which means his decision-making is personal and possibly not fully rational. She said she understood and ended the call. The next hour was the longest of the day. She ran it on motion, tasks, charts, a follow-up call with a client whose elderly Labrador had come through a complex dental procedure that morning, and she kept her phone in her front pocket where she could feel every notification. At 3:47, the phone buzzed. Not Vance, not a text. An incoming call from an unknown number, a different unknown number than the one that had sent the message the previous night. She stared at it for 2 full rings. Then she thought about what Vance had said. Call me before you respond. She called Vance first. Got voicemail. Called the secondary number Vance had given her. Got Aldez, who told her to answer the call if it came again and to keep whoever it was talking. It came again 40 seconds later. She answered. The voice on the other end was male, older, with the particular cadence of a person who had spent decades speaking in rooms where they held the authority. Controlled but pressured, the way a hand looks when it's gripping something too tightly. "Ms. Taft." She said nothing. "I think you know who this is." "Tell me anyway." A brief silence. "Welling, Court Welling." He said his own name like it was still a credential, like it still opened doors. "I want to discuss this situation before it goes further than it needs to." She looked at her phone screen. Aldez had said to keep him talking. She was keeping him talking. She switched the call to speaker, set the phone on the supply cart, and picked up a pen. "I'm listening." "The document that was filed. I want you to understand the context of how that. I know what the document is. There are aspects of this situation that aren't visible from your position. There are people involved at levels that will complicate this significantly if it proceeds through federal channels." His voice had shifted. The authority cadence was still there, but underneath it something else was working. Not fear exactly, something more calculated than fear. "I have information that would significantly benefit the investigation currently being conducted by Agent Vance. Information that goes beyond Meridian, beyond Farran, beyond anything in those files you've been holding on to." She kept her voice flat. "What kind of information?" "The contracting network that Meridian operates within is not isolated. It connects to procurement structures across multiple branches. There are people in those structures who have been operating the same scheme with different contractors, different animal assessment programs, different documentation systems." He paused. "I have names, transactions, records that are not in any federal database because they were maintained outside official systems by design." She wrote outside official systems on her notepad and circled it. "You're offering to cooperate," she said. "I'm offering to provide information of significant investigative value in exchange for a conversation, a direct conversation with Vance, before any further action is taken regarding my involvement." He wanted to negotiate. He was calling a veterinary nurse to negotiate with a federal investigation because he was cornered and the number he had for Vance apparently wasn't getting answered. She thought about what that meant, that he had her number, that he'd identified her as a path to Vance, that he was treating her as an intermediary rather than a threat. She said, "Give me one specific piece of the information you're describing, as evidence that it exists." A pause. "That's not how this works." "It's how it works with me." Another pause. Longer. She heard him breathing, shallow, slightly effortful. "There's a contracting officer, current active position. He sits on the approval board for 3 additional K9 assessment contracts that run through the same financial routing structure as Meridian. His name is Halbrook, Terrence Halbrook. He's been receiving parallel payments for 7 years. She wrote the name down. "That's enough for now," she said. "I'll pass your information to Agent Vance. I need you to tell her, I'll tell her you called." She picked the phone up. "Don't call this number again." She ended the call and immediately called Aldez back. "Did you get it?" she said. "Every word." His voice had that compressed quality of someone moving fast. "The trace ran. We have his location." She exhaled once, slow and controlled. "Where is he?" 40 minutes from here, a motel off Route 9 outside a town called Farland." She could hear the background noise shift, doors, movement, someone saying something she couldn't make out. "We're already moving. Vance will call you when he's in custody." She said okay. She put the phone in her pocket. She stood at the supply cart for a moment with her notepad in front of her. At the top of the page, she had written Welling's name when he'd said it. Below that, outside official systems. Below that, circled twice now, Halbrook. Terrence Halbrook. She stared at that last name. She turned to the computer at the medication station and opened the case management system, not looking for clinical files, looking for something else. A small, specific detail she had noticed 3 weeks ago and filed away without knowing why. The contracting information for Harwick's supply chain audit. Completed last month. She scrolled through it until she found the section on federal veterinary equipment contracts. She found the approval board signature for the most recent contract renewal. The second signatory, T. Halbrook. Her chest went cold. Halbrook wasn't just a name Welling had offered as a bargaining chip. Halbrook was connected to Harwick directly, had approved a contract renewal for this specific clinic, which meant Harwick's supply infrastructure was already threaded into the contracting network Welling had just described. She picked up her phone again, called Vance's number. Still voicemail. She called Aldez. When Welling gave me the name Halbrook, we're running it. Run it against Harwick Veterinary Medical Center specifically. Contract approval records from last month. A pause. Why? Because his signature is on a supply contract for this clinic. She kept her voice even. Which means someone with a direct financial connection to the fraudulent Canine Assessment Network has been approving contracts for the facility that identified the fracture that started this entire investigation. A long silence. Longer than she expected. Then, Taft, I need you to not move from where you are right now. I'm not moving. I mean physically. Don't go to your car, don't go outside. Go to where there are people around you and stay there until Vance calls you directly. Her pulse moved, not dramatically, just a notch upward, the body's honest assessment of information. What aren't you telling me? Halbrook's office is in the Federal Contracting Building on Seaver Street in Delmont. His voice was tight. It's 12 minutes from Harwick. And she understood then what he wasn't saying because she was already saying it to herself. That Halbrook, whose name had just been handed to a federal investigation by a desperate man making a phone call from a motel room, was about to be made aware of that fact. That when that happened, Halbrook would know exactly how his name had surfaced. That the chain from Cairo's fractured hip to Welling's bargaining chip to Halbrook's exposure all ran through one single fixed point, through a veterinary nurse in stained scrubs at a mid-tier clinic in Delmont, Colorado. She looked at the people around her, Bledsoe at the far end of the ward, a tech named Drew doing instrument prep, the receptionist visible through the window of the front desk. Ordinary people in an ordinary building that had become something else. Her phone buzzed. A message from a number she didn't recognize, a third number now, different from the previous two. She looked at the screen. The message was 4 words. We know where you are. Then her phone buzzed again. Another message, same number, arriving 4 seconds after the first. A photograph, taken from outside the building. Through the window of the medication station where she had been standing for the last 20 minutes. She moved away from the window. Not running, walking, because running would tell anyone watching that she knew she was being watched. And knowing you were being watched while the person watching you still believed they had the advantage was information worth holding on to for at least another 30 seconds. She crossed to the instrument prep area where Drew was working and positioned herself behind the shelving unit, still visible to the room, not visible from the exterior window. She forwarded the photograph to Aldez with a single added line. Taken from outside medication station window, south-facing, ground level. Then she called him. He answered before the first ring completed. I see it. How many people do you have at Harwick right now? 2. They're inside. A pause that contained the sound of fast decision-making. I'm calling it in. Don't move. I need you to also tell me whether Halbrook has been contacted yet. Working on it. Because if he hasn't, and someone in his network sent that photograph, then he knows his name is in play, and he's responding faster than you anticipated. I understand the situation, Taft. Then move faster than you're moving, she said, and ended the call. Drew looked up from the instrument tray. I was 26, broadly built, the kind of person who looked like he could handle things but hadn't yet been tested in a way that confirmed it. You okay? I need you to do something for me without asking why, Raina said. He looked at her for a moment, surprised by her tone, which was different from the tone she used when she was asking him to do routine things. Okay. Go to the front desk and tell Tessa to lock the side entrance. The keypad code, not just the handle. Then come back here. He set down the instrument he was holding and went without another word. She noted that in her assessment of him and moved to the supply cabinet at the end of the room, where she could see both the hallway and the recovery ward and neither window. Vance called 40 seconds later. I've got the photograph, she said. Her voice had dropped into a register that was not quite alarmed and not quite calm, something functional and pressured between the two. We're tracing the number. It's another burner, but the photograph was taken in the last 15 minutes, which means whoever took it is or was within 10 feet of the south exterior wall of your building. Is it Halbrook? We don't know yet. Halbrook's office shows him logged into his workstation as of 40 minutes ago. If he sent it, he's not doing it himself. A brief pause. Welling is in custody. Agents reached the motel at Farland 8 minutes ago. He was in the room. He did not resist. One piece of it resolved. Raina filed that and moved forward. The photograph is a message. They want me to know I'm visible. Yes. Which means they want me to do something. Run. Destroy something. Call someone. She thought about it. Or they want me scared enough to be predictable. Don't be predictable. Vance's voice was sharp. My people inside the building are moving to your location now. Stay put. Two of Vance's team appeared at the far end of the hallway 30 seconds later. A man and a woman Raina had seen in the conference room earlier, both in the same deliberately unremarkable clothing, both moving with the quick economy of people who had been waiting to move. The woman went to the south exterior wall. The man came to Raina. Agent Pryor, he said, you need to step away from any exterior-facing position. I already did. He looked at where she was standing and nodded once. Good. He had a radio in his left hand and a phone in his right, and he was managing both with the divided attention of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of fractured focus situation. Drew came back. He looked at Pryor, looked at Raina, and had the good sense to ask only one question. What do you need me to do? Keep doing what you were doing, Raina said. Don't tell anyone about the side entrance. He went back to the instrument tray. Outside, nothing happened. No movement at the south wall. No car in the parking lot that didn't belong. Pryor's partner spent 4 minutes at every exterior-facing window on the south and west sides of the building and came back with nothing. Whoever had taken the photograph had done so and left. Which was, Raina knew, the point. The message wasn't about physical threat. It was about letting her know the boundary of her safety had already been crossed once, and whether it could be crossed again was not entirely within her control. It was an intimidation instrument, a precise one. At 4:15, Vance arrived at Harwick in person. She came through the front entrance this time, not the side, and she went directly to the conference room and called Raina in. She looked like someone who had been moving hard for 6 hours and had decided not to let that show, but hadn't entirely succeeded. There was a crease along her jacket where she'd been sitting in a vehicle, and her hair had lost the precision it had maintained through the first 2 days of this. She sat down and put both phones on the table and her notepad beside them. Here's where we are, she said. Durrell is at the field office. His attorney is negotiating the terms of a cooperation agreement. Farrow has already given a preliminary statement implicating Durrell in the systematic falsification of 17 evaluation records over a period of 4 years. She opened the notepad. Welling is being transported. His attorney made contact within minutes of the arrest, which confirms the prearrangement. He is not cooperating yet, but he's also not in a position to block the financial records, which are already in federal hands. And Farron. We're arresting Farron this evening. She said it the same way she said everything, without satisfaction, without drama. The payment records connecting him to the Meridian Shell Company are clean. The forensic accountants have reconstructed 7 years of transactions. It's not complicated, ultimately. It's a simple corruption structure dressed up in contracting language. She looked at the notepad. Halbrook. Yes. Terrence Halbrook has been placed on administrative suspension pending federal review. His building access was revoked at 1400 hours. She paused. The photograph sent to your phone. The number traces to a prepaid device purchased at a convenience store in Delmont 4 days ago. We have security footage from the store. She turned her phone around. On the screen was a still image from a security camera, a man at a convenience store counter, partial profile, dark jacket. Raina looked at it for a moment. Do you recognize him? Vance asked. She studied the image. The angle was poor, but the build, the posture, the way the jacket sat on his shoulders. No, she said. Then, maybe. She looked again. The posture. He stands like someone with military background, that specific forward carry in the shoulders. We think he's connected to Halbrook's office, a contractor, not a direct employee. We're running it. Vance put the phone down. The photograph was meant to destabilize you before the documentation deadline. It failed. The deadline passed at 1700. The documentation request has been formally actioned. That process cannot be reversed. The deadline had passed. Raina let herself understand that for a moment. What it meant. What it closed off for the people who had been trying to outrun it. What about Cass? She said. A pause. He called in sick this morning. I know. And Meridian called Garver the day after Cairo's intake. Someone here made a communication. Vance looked at her steadily. Dr. Philip Cass accessed Cairo's case file at 11:47 the evening of the intake. outside his normal access hours, from a personal device using his administrator credentials. She let that land. He contacted a number registered to a Meridian administrative account at 11:52 the same evening. 17 minutes. Cairo had barely been in the system 17 minutes before Cass had flagged it to the people responsible for hiding the injury. He's not a principal in the fraud, Vance continued. Based on what we have, it appears to be a single communication, a heads up from someone with a prior relationship to the organization rather than an embedded operative. But it's enough for a federal obstruction inquiry. Raina thought about Cass reviewing the imaging, about his expression when the lateral views confirmed the fracture, about the way he'd said thank you, Raina like a period at the end of a sentence. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt something more complicated and less satisfying than that. He didn't know what he was protecting, she said. Not really. That's a distinction the inquiry will make, Vance said. Not us. Farron's arrest happened at 6:40 in the evening, at his home in a suburb of Fort Calvert, and Raina knew about it because Vance called her while it was happening, not to narrate it, to tell her one specific thing. He kept records too. She hadn't expected that. What kind? Personal records. Not of the fraud, of the decisions he made. Memos to himself, dated, describing what he did with certain reports and why. Bureaucratic self-preservation. He was building a defense in case the structure ever collapsed above him. A pause. He documented the day he received your report. He documented his conversation with Welling about it. He documented the decision to reassign you. She sat with that. He wrote down that he buried my report. He wrote down that he was directed to bury it by Welling, and that he complied. He wrote down why he complied. Another pause. He was being paid. He documented the first payment. I think he was scared, and keeping records was the only way he felt like he had any control over what he'd agreed to. That doesn't help him. No, it helps us considerably. Her voice shifted. And it confirms your account completely. Everything you reported 6 years ago, the discrepancies you flagged, the evaluation failures you documented, the names you attached to specific records, it's all confirmed by the man who was paid to make it disappear. Raina didn't respond immediately. She was sitting in the break room with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, and outside the window the parking lot was dark and ordinary, and the clinic was running its evening routine with the quiet persistence of a place that continued regardless of what happened in its conference room or its back hallway or its medication station window. 6 years, 47 folders. A filing cabinet in a storage unit she'd been paying monthly fees on for reasons she'd sometimes struggled to articulate. And one retired military dog who had walked into a veterinary emergency room with a limp that everyone else had categorized as a strain. She picked up the coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway. The following morning arrived with the specific quality of aftermath. Not resolution, not yet, but the unmistakable texture of something that is broken and is now showing its full shape for the first time. Raina drove to Harwick in morning light that was cleaner than it had been all week. A Colorado clarity that had nothing to do with what was happening and everything to do with weather, but that she noted regardless. Cass was not at work. He would not be returning for the foreseeable future, pending the federal inquiry. Bledsoe was covering again, and the staff moved around the absence with the discomfort of people who understood something had happened but not yet what. Garver came in at 9. He was not there for Cairo. Cairo's surgical consultation was scheduled for later in the week with a specialist Vance's team had recommended, a veterinary orthopedic surgeon out of a university program in Denver who had agreed to take the case as a priority. Garver was there because he'd heard, through channels Raina didn't ask about, that things had moved. He sat across from her in the consultation room, and she told him, in plain language, what she could tell him. Meridian Canine Assessment Services was under federal investigation. Its director was in custody. The veterinary contractor who had conducted Cairo's evaluation had agreed to cooperate. The financial records connecting the fraudulent clearance scheme to a military insider had been secured, and multiple arrests were either completed or in process. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. 11 dogs, he said. He had heard that number somewhere. She didn't ask where. At least 11, she said. The investigation is reviewing every evaluation Meridian conducted under the relevant contracting period. He looked at the table. He had the expression of a man absorbing something he'd suspected was true, but had hoped wasn't, which was a different kind of difficult than simple shock. Rook, he said. The dog Marcus Webb had euthanized in April. If someone had caught what they missed. Possibly, she said. I don't know Rook's specifics. She didn't offer more than that because she didn't have more than that, and offering speculation to a man sitting across from her with that expression would have been a different kind of cruelty than the kind that had already been done to him. How did you know? He said. The first day. You looked at Cairo for 30 seconds. She considered the question. I've seen a lot of working dogs in pain. I know what hiding looks like. She paused. And I've spent a long time learning to trust what I'm looking at rather than what I've been told to expect. He held her gaze for a moment. You should have been listened to 6 years ago. Yes, she said. No qualification, no deflection, just the plain fact of it. The collapse of the structure that had protected Meridian and its principles did not happen in one dramatic moment. It happened the way most institutional failures happen. In stages, each one exposing the next, the whole thing gradually losing the shape it had maintained through active effort for years. Durrell's cooperation agreement was finalized within 48 hours of his arrest. In exchange for a reduced charge on 3 of the 9 counts against him, he provided the complete financial records of the Meridian Shell Company structure, including the full payment history to Farron and the authorization chain that ran up to Welling. He gave the investigators the names of 2 additional contracting officers at other installations who had received payments from a parallel structure operating under a different company name. He gave them documentation he had maintained, apparently out of the same fear-based logic as Farron, in a folder on an encrypted drive in his office, a drive that his attorney had advised him to surrender immediately upon arrest. The encrypted drive contained, among other things, a record of every evaluation Meridian had flagged internally as problematic, cases where the fraudulent clearance had been issued over the objections or concerns of the examining contractor, cases where the dog's clinical presentation had clearly indicated findings that the official record suppressed. 17 cases. Matching the number Raina had documented from the opposite direction, 6 years earlier. When Vance told her about the drive, she said, he kept a record of every dog he knew had been cleared fraudulently. Yes. And he kept it encrypted on a drive in his office. Yes. What was he planning to do with it? Vance was quiet for a moment. I don't think he was planning anything specific. I think he was doing the same thing you were doing, keeping the record because he couldn't bring himself to delete it. She paused. The difference is that he was keeping it on behalf of a crime he was committing, and you were keeping it on behalf of the truth. Welling's cooperation, when it came, was harder and slower, and ultimately more useful than Durrell's. He had spent 36 years in military service, and the machinery of his self-preservation was more sophisticated than Durrell's and more entrenched than Farron's. His attorneys negotiated for 11 days. When the agreement was finally structured, it included a formal admission of his role in directing the burial of Raina's original reports, a detailed account of the financial arrangement between himself and Farron and the Meridian Shell structure, and the names of 3 additional individuals connected to what turned out to be a broader contracting corruption network that extended beyond canine assessment programs into equipment procurement and facility maintenance contracts. The broader investigation that spun out of the Meridian case was not Raina's to manage or follow in detail. She heard about it in pieces through Vance's periodic updates, and she filed the pieces without attaching particular weight to them. The scale of it was significant. The specifics were, at that point, someone else's work. What was hers was the clinical work, the evaluation of the dogs, working with a team of veterinary specialists that Vance's office had coordinated with the Department of Defense. Harwick became a regional processing point for emergency assessments of retired canines who had been cleared through Meridian's program. Over 3 weeks, 11 dogs came through the clinic for comprehensive imaging and evaluation. 8 of them showed previously undiagnosed conditions ranging from moderate to severe. 4 of those required immediate surgical intervention. 1. A 7-year-old Malinois named Dex had a spinal compression injury so advanced that the specialist who examined him said it was remarkable the dog had been mobile at all. Raina ran the intake assessments on all 11. She did it with the same systematic attention she brought to everything, and she documented every finding with the same precision she had maintained for 6 years in notebooks and filing cabinets and on dated notepads. She was not performing thoroughness. She was simply being thorough, the way she had always been, in contexts where no one had been paying attention, and in contexts where everything depended on it. Bledsoe, who had taken over as acting senior veterinarian while Cass's situation was unresolved, watched her work through the second assessment and afterward said, without particular preamble, "I've been here 3 years and I didn't know any of this about you." Raina was writing up her notes. Most people didn't ask. "I should have." She said it plainly, without excess. "The intake on Cairo, the flags you raised, I heard about it after the fact." "It's done," Raina said. "I know it is. I'm saying it anyway." Bledsoe looked at the notes on the table, the careful, dated, specific documentation of what Raina had found in the dog she'd just assessed. "You want to run tomorrow's first 2 intakes?" "Yes," Raina said. "Good." That was all. No ceremony, no formal acknowledgement, just the simple reallocation of authority that happens when competence has been visible long enough that pretending otherwise requires more effort than anyone is willing to spend. Cass resigned from Harwick 12 days after the investigation became publicly known, which it did through a federal press statement that named Meridian, Durrell, Welling, and Farran, and referenced the clinical identification of a fraudulent clearance at a veterinary facility in Del Monte, Colorado, as the initial trigger for the federal investigation. The press statement did not name Raina. She had not asked for that omission and had not asked for it to be removed. The question of what was said publicly was Vance's territory, and she trusted Vance to handle it appropriately. Cass's resignation letter, which Bledsoe showed her without comment, cited personal reasons. Raina read it once and handed it back. She did not think about what personal reasons meant in that context, or what Cass's internal narrative about the sequence of events looked like. She did not have the bandwidth for that, and she was not certain it was her business. What she did think about, what she returned to in the early mornings before her shift and sometimes in the evenings after, was the number 11, the dogs that had died. She thought about what it meant to build a structure of incentives and protections and documentation suppression that resulted, at its operational base, in animals suffering alone in the care of handlers who had been told the animals were fine. She thought about Garver sitting in a consultation room saying he's been in pain for 4 months, with the expression of a man confronting a guilt that wasn't his, but had landed on him regardless. She thought about Cairo, whose surgical consultation had been scheduled and then rescheduled due to the specialist caseload, and then finally confirmed for the following week. And she thought, less often than the other things, but with a particular quality of attention when it arrived, about the message she had received on the second night. You should have destroyed those records when you had the chance. The person who had sent it had believed that the records were the threat, had believed that a person who held inconvenient documentation could be frightened into eliminating it. What they had not understood, what Durrell had not understood, what Welling had not understood, what the man in the dark jacket taking photographs through a window had not understood, was that the records were not the source of the threat. The person who had kept them was. The records were evidence, Raina was the witness. And a witness, unlike a filing cabinet, cannot be destroyed without creating a different and more serious problem than the one it was meant to solve. She understood this about herself without drama. It was simply how she had been built. Through training and inclination and years of practice in rooms where the choice between staying and going had been made so many times, it had stopped feeling like a choice. At the end of the 3rd week, Vance came back to Harwick. She arrived in the early afternoon and went to the room where Raina was completing post-assessment notes on a retired German Shepherd named Volta, who had come through the day before with a previously undiagnosed elbow dysplasia, painful, manageable, correctable, with appropriate intervention, and a handler who now knew what he was dealing with. Vance sat down across the table and put a document in front of her. It was a formal federal commendation, Raina's name at the top, specific language about the clinical identification, the preserved documentation, the investigative cooperation, and the outcome of the case, signed by the relevant authority, dated. She read it. Then she set it down. "Holbrook," she said, "what happened?" "Indicted on 6 counts, conspiracy, bribery, obstruction, 3 counts of federal contracting fraud. He's not cooperating, which his attorneys may eventually persuade him was a mistake." Vance's voice was level. "His administrative suspension has been converted to termination. His security clearance is revoked. The contractor who took the photograph. Identified. Former military, private security background, currently employed by a firm with contracts to two of Halbrook's approved vendors. He's been interviewed. He's cooperating. Raina nodded. She looked at the commendation, at the language that named, in formal bureaucratic phrasing, the things she had done and why they mattered. She thought about what it would have meant to receive this 6 years ago, when the reports were fresh, and she still believed someone was going to do something with them. She thought about what it meant now, not less, not more, but differently. The way a thing can be true and important and still arrive in a form that doesn't quite fit the shape of what you'd imagined. "There's something else," Vance said. Raina looked at her. "The review of Meridian's complete evaluation history. 34 dogs in the relevant contracting period. We've now assessed 22 of them." She paused. 19 had previously undiagnosed conditions. Of the 11 originally listed as deceased, 4 of those deaths are now being reclassified pending formal forensic veterinary review. 4 of 11. "They may have been treatable," Raina said. "That's the working assessment." Vance held her gaze. "The formal determination will take time, but yes." She let that sit. There was nothing to do with it except hold it, which she did, and then she said, "What are you not telling me?" Vance looked at her for a moment. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. This came through the federal document review this morning. It was in Welling's personal files, physical files, not digital, which is why it took longer to surface. She put it on the table. It was a memo, dated 6 years and 4 months ago, 3 weeks before Raina had submitted her original report to Farron. Welling's letterhead, a single paragraph. She read it. Her jaw set. The memo was a preemptive instruction, sent from Welling to Farron before the report had even been filed, directing him on how to handle anticipated complaints from nursing staff regarding Meridian evaluation discrepancies. It used language about protecting contracting relationships and managing personnel who exceeded their operational remit. It concluded with a specific directive. Any documentation submitted through informal channels was to be received, acknowledged in writing for compliance purposes, and referred to a review process that did not exist. A review process that did not exist. They had designed the disappearance before she had even written the report. They had seen her coming, had known she was building a case, and had constructed the mechanism to absorb and neutralize it weeks before she walked into Farron's office. She looked at the memo for a long time. "He knew," she said. "Before I submitted anything. He already knew what I'd found." "Someone told him," Vance said carefully. "We don't know who yet, but someone in your chain of command at the time communicated to Welling that you were documenting Meridian discrepancies." She sat with that, the specific weight of it. Not just that her report had been buried, she'd known that for 6 years, but that it had been buried before it was written, that the system had looked at her and looked at what she was building and constructed a disposal mechanism with her name already attached to it. "The person who told him," she said. "We're still identifying the communication chain." Vance's voice was careful. "It may take time." Raina looked at the memo on the table, at the date at the top, at Welling's signature at the bottom. "I want to know the name," she said. "I know you do." Vance held her gaze. "And I'll tell you when I have it confirmed." She paused. "What I can tell you right now is that everything they built to stop you from being heard is coming down. Every piece of it. And the memo..." She tapped the edge of the paper. "This is the piece that confirms it was never about your credentials or your role or the limits of what a nurse was supposed to flag. They knew the information was accurate. They built the disposal system because they knew." The room was quiet. Outside, in the recovery ward, one of the assessed dogs had started a low, even vocalization, not distressed, just present, announcing itself to the space. Raina listened to it for a moment. They had known the information was accurate. She had always known that. But there was a difference between knowing it yourself and holding a piece of paper that proved someone else had known it too, had known it, and buried it anyway, and built a structure to make sure it stayed buried, and had done all of this while 11 dogs suffered through undiagnosed injuries, and some of them died in the care of handlers who had been told they were fine. She looked at Vance. "What do you need from me?" "Your formal statement about the timeline, incorporating this document's implications." Vance reached for the memo. "And your patience, for a little longer." "I've had 6 years of practice," Raina said. Vance looked at her with the specific expression she reserved for moments when something landed that she hadn't expected. Then she folded the memo back along its crease. "One more thing," she said. "Cairo's surgery." "Tomorrow morning," Raina said. "The specialist arrived in Delmont this afternoon." "Garver will be there?" "He asked to be present for the prep." She paused. "I told him he could stay in the waiting area." Vance nodded once. "Good." She stood and collected the commendation from the table, leaving Raina a copy, taking the original for processing. At the door, she stopped. "The Hallbrook contractor, the one who took the photograph." Raina looked at her. "When we interviewed him, we asked him what he knew about the target." She paused. "He said he was told she was a disgruntled former employee with falsified records and an agenda. He said he was told she was nobody important." Another pause. "He seemed genuinely surprised by the scope of what had actually happened." She left. Raina sat in the room alone for a moment. Nobody important. She had been nobody important in Farron's office, and nobody important in Welling's memo, and nobody important in the structure that had been built to absorb what she knew and render it harmless. And in the morning, Cairo was going into surgery with a specialist who had driven from Denver because a nurse nobody had taken seriously had looked at a dog for 30 seconds and seen something that a fraudulent clearance system had been paid to miss. She picked up her pen and went back to the notes on Volta's assessment. She dated the top of the page. She wrote in the careful, specific, documented language she had always used. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message from Garver. "Cairo ate his whole dinner tonight, first time in weeks." She read it. She set the phone back down. She kept writing. Cairo's surgery took 4 hours and 11 minutes. Raina knew the exact duration because she had been in the building for all of it, not in the surgical suite, which was the specialist territory, but present in the way she was always present, moving through her regular work while holding the awareness of what was happening 2 rooms over. She had learned, across years of caring for animals in crisis, that hovering outside a surgical door helped nobody and communicated an anxiety that could transfer to the staff who needed to stay functional inside. So she did her work. She updated charts. She ran the morning medication rounds on the 3 dogs still in post-surgical recovery from the assessment week. She drank half a cup of coffee and forgot about the other half. At 11:40, the specialist, Dr. Renata Osei, came out of the suite still in her scrubs and found Raina at the supply station. "Clean repair," she said. "The femoral head was in worse shape than the imaging suggested, which I expected. We had to take more of the damaged tissue than the original plan, but the reconstruction is solid." She paused. "He'll need 12 weeks of strict activity restriction. Then we'll see." "Prognosis?" "Good, if the restrictions hold and the rehabilitation protocol is followed consistently." She looked at Raina the way a specialist looks at a referring clinician she has spent 3 days reading about in federal case documents. "You caught this at a point where he still had good structural candidates for repair. 2 more months and we would have been talking about a different outcome." Raina nodded. She did not perform gratitude because the work wasn't done for performance. "Thank you for coming down from Denver." Osei looked at her for a moment. "The federal coordinator who arranged this told me a little about the case, the original evaluation failure, the documentation history." She paused. "I've been in this field for 18 years. I've done a lot of work with military and working dogs. I've seen clearance paperwork that didn't match what I found on the table." She held Raina's gaze. "I always assumed it was error. I stopped assuming that this week." Raina said nothing to that. Sometimes the right response to a person arriving at a true understanding was simply to let them have it. Garver was in the waiting area and had been there since 8:30. He stood when Osei came to find him, and he listened to the same information with the expression of a man receiving news he'd stopped allowing himself to expect. When Osei finished, he said thank you twice, which was once more than necessary and entirely understandable. When she left to complete her post-operative notes, he stood in the waiting area for a moment without moving. Raina came and stood near him, not close enough to intrude, but close enough to be there. 12 weeks, he said. "It's not short," she said. "But it ends." He looked at the door that led to the recovery area where Cairo was coming out of anesthesia. "Can I see him?" "When he's stable enough to be moved to a regular recovery space. Another hour, maybe." He sat back down. He looked at his hands. "Marcus Webb called me last night. Rook's handler." He paused. He'd gotten the notification from the federal investigators about the review, about Meridian. She waited. He said he didn't know if he was angry or just... He stopped, started again. He said he didn't know what to do with it. That Rook had been fine, supposedly, and then wasn't, and then was gone, and he'd spent 8 months thinking it was just age and bad luck. He looked at the door again. And now he finds out it wasn't. No, Raina said. It wasn't. He asked me if he should be angry at someone specific or just another stop. He's not good at this kind of thing. Feelings, I mean. Neither am I. You don't have to be good at it, she said. You just have to let yourself have it. He looked at her. A long look. The kind that was trying to find the edges of who she was. How do you do it? He gestured vaguely at the space between the two of them. The staying calm. The just keep going. She thought about the real answer, which was that she didn't always stay calm and didn't always just keep going. And that there had been a winter night about 4 years ago, when she had sat in her car outside the storage unit for 40 minutes, and then driven home without opening it because she had temporarily run out of whatever it was that kept her going back. She thought about the fact that steadiness was not a natural state but a practiced one, and that practice required failure to have any meaning. She said, I've had a lot of practice being the person in the room that nobody's looking at. It turns out that position has advantages. He thought about that. Like what? You see everything. She paused. Nobody edits themselves for the person they think doesn't matter. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Cairo walked up to you in 30 seconds. He did. He's never done that with anyone he didn't know, not once in 8 years. He looked at the door again. Dogs are supposed to be bad judges of character. People say that. But I've never actually believed it. They're not bad judges, she said. They're just honest about what they find. The federal proceedings moved through the following weeks with the grinding, impersonal efficiency of a large institution digesting a large problem. Raina tracked them the way she tracked most things that were not directly in front of her, attentively but without urgency, noting what arrived and filing it against what she already knew. Jarrell's cooperation agreement was formally accepted in the 4th week. He pleaded to 5 counts, 2 of fraud, 2 of conspiracy, 1 of obstruction. His attorney had negotiated the sentencing recommendation downward in exchange for the encrypted drive and his testimony, but the judge at the preliminary hearing indicated that the cooperation discount had limits in a case involving the demonstrable suffering of animals under federal protective care. The sentencing date was set for 90 days out. The reporting on it was thorough and not particularly favorable to Jarrell, which was accurate. Farhan pleaded guilty to 4 counts and received a sentencing recommendation that his own documentation, the memos, the dated records of his decisions, the evidence that he had understood what he was doing and done it anyway, had significantly undermined. His attorneys had attempted to argue that the memos demonstrated a conflicted actor rather than a willing one. The federal prosecutor had pointed out, in a brief that Vance forwarded to Raina without comment, that a conflicted actor who accepts payment for 7 years and documents his conflicts in private memos while never once reporting them to any oversight authority is functionally indistinguishable from a willing one at the point of consequence. Raina read that brief once. She did not read it again. Welling's case was the most complicated and the slowest, because Welling had the most sophisticated legal representation and the most to protect and the longest institutional history to leverage. His attorneys filed 4 preliminary motions in the first month. 2 were denied immediately. 1 was held under advisement. 1 succeeded in narrowing the scope of 1 count by a technical margin that his attorney characterized as a significant victory and that the federal team characterized as irrelevant to the overall case. The cooperation agreement he had eventually signed covered his testimony regarding the financial structures and the chain of command that had authorized Meridian's initial certification. It did not reduce the number of counts against him. It reduced, potentially, the sentencing range on 3 of them. He had, in the end, given investigators the name of the person in Raina's former chain of command who had communicated to him that she was building a case 6 years ago. Vance told Raina that name in a phone call on a Tuesday evening in the 7th week. The name was someone she had worked alongside for 11 months during her last active posting, a senior nursing administrator named Delora Marsh, who had apparently mentioned to her own supervising officer that a nurse in the K-9 unit was accumulating documentation about contractor evaluations. Marsh had not done it out of malice, as far as the investigation could determine. She had done it because she was the kind of person who told supervisors things, who believed that keeping senior officials informed was part of her professional role, who had not understood or had not asked what happened to information once it moved upward. The road from Marsh's innocent administrative update to Welling's preemptive memo to Farron's buried report to 11 dead dogs was not a straight line. It passed through choices that were made by people who understood what they were doing and people who didn't, through greed and cowardice and bureaucratic incuriosity, through a system that had developed very effective ways of protecting its own financial interests while producing official documentation that said something different. Raina sat with the name Delora Marsh for a few days. She thought about what it meant, that the original breach had not been a betrayal, but a miscalculation. That the person who had set everything in motion had probably never known what she'd set in motion. She didn't know what to do with that exactly. It didn't make her angry in the way that Farron made her angry or Welling made her angry. It made her tired, which was its own kind of response. She did not contact Marsh. There was nothing productive in that direction, and Vance had indicated that Marsh was being interviewed as a witness rather than a subject, which meant the legal process was handling what needed handling. She let it go. Not entirely and not cleanly, but functionally. Cairo came through the first 4 weeks of recovery with the specific stoic difficulty of a working dog being asked to do the hardest thing a working dog is ever asked to do: nothing. Garver followed the restriction protocol with military precision, which helped, and checked in with Harwick every 3 days, which also helped, and sent Raina a photograph every week of Cairo in his recovery space, lying on a specific orthopedic mat that Osei had specified, looking at the camera with the expression of an animal that had strong opinions about the current situation and limited ability to act on them. At week 6, Raina ran the interim assessment herself. She ran it the way she ran everything, methodically, with full attention, letting the dog tell her what he was telling her, rather than looking for what she expected. She checked the surgical site, the surrounding musculature, the compensatory loading patterns, the range of motion at the repaired joint against the baseline Osei had documented. When she was done, she wrote her notes. Then she called Osei. "Healing ahead of schedule," she said. "Not dramatically, but the muscle restoration in the gluteal group is better than the 6-week projection. I think the restrictions have been followed exactly." "Garver," Osei said. "Garver," Raina confirmed. "Any indication of pain-masking behavior?" "No." She paused. "He's actually showing the discomfort more openly than I expected, which sounds counterintuitive, but I think it means he's not trying to hide it the way he used to." "Because he doesn't have to anymore," Osei said. "Yes." She looked at Cairo, who was watching her from the mat with his ears at half attention. "He's a different dog than the one that came in here 6 weeks ago." She meant it clinically. She also meant it in the other way, which was harder to document, but equally true. The sentencing hearings began in the 9th week and ran across 3 separate dates, because the cases had been separated by defendant but consolidated for judicial efficiency, which meant that Raina received updates on 3 different days across a 2-week span. Durrell received 7 years on the consolidated counts, with the cooperation reduction applied to 2 of the 5 charges. His attorney described the outcome as reflecting the mitigating factors of his cooperation. The federal prosecutor described it as reflecting the minimum appropriate consequence for a scheme that had operated for 4 years, generated approximately $2.3 million in fraudulent billing, and resulted in documented harm to 19 animals under federal protective consideration. The judge, in her sentencing statement, used language that Vance forwarded to Raina in a text message with no additional comment. "The harm done to animals in the care of this nation's service members is not an abstract accounting entry. It is a betrayal of a specific and serious obligation." Farron received 5 years, reduced from the original recommendation by the cooperation credit his memos had paradoxically both harmed and helped him earn. He would serve it at a federal corrections facility. His military pension was suspended pending the completion of a separate administrative review. He had, at the sentencing hearing, made a statement that his attorney had prepared and that he had delivered in a flat, reading voice without looking up from the paper. It expressed regret in general terms. It did not mention Raina by name, which was probably his attorney's decision. It did not mention the dogs at all, which was probably his own. Welling was the 3rd hearing on the last day. He received 9 years on the primary counts, with the cooperation discount applied narrowly to the obstruction charge, The conspiracy and fraud charges ran at full weight. His advisory board positions had been formally terminated in the second week of the investigation, and the 3 defense contracting firms he'd been advising had issued statements of various flavors of regret about their association with him. 2 of those statements had been reported in defense industry publications and had generated significant attention in the contracting community, which was, Vance had said, in one of her updates, not nothing. At the sentencing hearing, Welling had stood for the statement the judge addressed to him directly. He had stood the way he had probably always stood in official settings, correctly, with the posture of a man who had spent decades in uniform. But something in his face, according to the federal reporter whose coverage Raina read online that evening, had looked like a person who had finally understood that the posture no longer meant what it had always meant to him. He had said, when given the opportunity to speak, "I understand the court's determination." That was all. Raina read that online at her kitchen table with the remainder of her dinner going cold beside her, and she sat with it for a while. She thought about the memo dated 6 years and 4 months ago, about the review process that did not exist, about the specific calculation of a person who had looked at her reports and her name and her role and decided that what she knew could be made to disappear. She thought about being right for 6 years in an empty room. She thought about what it had cost. Not in the dramatic way of movies, not the collapsing on the floor cost, but the quieter and more corrosive cost of being someone whose judgment had been deliberately invalidated in official record, who had carried the knowledge of a wrong thing and the inability to make anyone with authority address it, who had paid a monthly storage fee for years as the single most concrete expression of her refusal to let the truth be buried with the bureaucracy. She didn't feel triumphant. She hadn't expected to. Triumph required a before and after that lined up cleanly, and this didn't line up cleanly. 11 dogs were still dead. 4 of those deaths were being formally reviewed as potentially preventable. Marsh had never intended harm. Farron had delivered a statement without looking up from the paper. What she felt was something more specific and more durable than triumph. It was the feeling of a thing having been seen, of the record finally matching reality, of the documents in the filing cabinet and the documents in the federal archive arriving at the same conclusion from opposite directions, of her name in the forged clearance and her name in the federal commendation existing in the same timeline and the correct one having won. She pushed her plate to the side. She opened her notepad and wrote the date in a single line. Sentencing complete. Then she closed it and went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept better than she had in several weeks. Holbrook's separate federal proceeding ran on a longer timeline because his attorneys were well-resourced and combative, and because the contracting corruption case that had spun out of the Meridian investigation was broader and more complex than the original canine assessment fraud. Raina followed it in the peripheral way that she followed things that were no longer directly in front of her. She gave her formal statement in the Holbrook proceeding in the 11th week, in a federal building in Delmont, in a room with a long table and good lighting and a court reporter who typed with complete equanimity regardless of what was being said. Her statement covered what she had observed, what she had documented, what she had preserved, and what she had communicated to Vance when she had made the call. It was factual and specific, and she delivered it the same way she delivered clinical findings, without editorializing, without performance, in the plain language of someone describing things they actually observed. Afterward, in the hallway, the prosecuting attorney, a compact, efficient woman named Broder, who had been nothing but direct with Raina across 3 preparatory meetings, said, "You're a very good witness." "I've had 6 years to prepare," Raina said. Broder smiled at that, a small, genuine one. "Most people who've been in your position for 6 years come into a room like that carrying some of it. The anger, she gestured, the weight of having been right for a long time." "I carried it into the room," Raina said. "I just didn't put it on the table." Broder looked at her for a moment. "That's the discipline, isn't it?" "That's the only thing that works," Raina said. Cairo's 12-week assessment fell on a Thursday in early spring when the light in Delmont had finally committed to warmth and the parking lot at Harwick smelled like something thawing. Garver brought him in at 8 as scheduled. Cairo walked through the side entrance on a loose lead, and Raina watched him come down the hallway with the specific attention she brought to movement assessment, tracking the pattern of his gait, the load distribution, the swing phase on the left rear leg. He was not fully symmetrical. She hadn't expected him to be. Full recovery from this kind of repair at this age, in a dog with this service history, was not a realistic metric. What she was looking for was function, comfort, the absence of the deep compensatory patterns that had told the real story on the day he had come in. She found what she was looking for. The limp was present but minimal, a slight preference, not a protection. The gluteal musculature had rebuilt substantially. The swing phase was clean. He moved through the hallway without the micro-hesitations that had marked every step he'd taken 6 weeks ago. She took him to exam room 2. She ran the full assessment with Garver watching from the corner, checking the surgical site, the joint mobility, the muscle tone, the neurological indicators. She worked without narrating, which Garver had learned by now meant she was thinking rather than withholding, and he waited without talking, which she had come to understand was one of the better things about him. When she was done, she stood back. Cairo was sitting on the exam table looking at her. Not the anxious, hypervigilant attention of the animal she had first seen. This was something quieter and more settled. I was simply watching her in the way animals watch people they have decided to trust. He's not masking the residual discomfort, she said. He's carrying it, but openly. That's the difference. Garver looked at the dog. Is that good? It's honest, she said. For a working dog, honest is almost always better than hidden. She made her final notes. Full release from activity restriction. I want him on the graduated exercise protocol for another 4 weeks before anything high impact. But for daily life, walks, normal movement, living the way he wants to live, he's clear. Garver exhaled. Not dramatically, just the specific release of breath that happens when something you've been holding for a long time is allowed to set down. He looks different, he said. He is different. She capped her pen. He's not carrying what he was carrying. Garver looked at her then, the same searching look he'd given her in the first week, but arriving at something he hadn't found yet at that point. Neither are you, he said. You look different too. She considered whether that was true. She supposed it might be. The sentencing finished last week, she said. I know. I read the coverage. He paused. All of it. She let that be what it was. What do you do now? He asked. She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it since the day the documentation deadline had passed, and the structure that had kept 6 years of truth in a storage unit in Mesa Vault had finally come apart. She had thought about what someone does with the specific skill set she had, the clinical knowledge, the documentation discipline, the ability to see what animals were hiding and understand what it meant. She had talked to Vance about it once, in the last of Vance's formal follow-up visits. Not in terms of a plan, but in terms of a possibility that had been forming in the back of her awareness since the week the 11 dogs had come through Harwick for their assessments. There's no formal oversight program for retired military canines, she said. There are handlers, there are adopting families, there are individual vets, but there's no systematic follow-up evaluation structure, no clinical surveillance, no documentation standard for transition health. She paused. Vance's office is in conversations with the DoD about establishing one. Garver was quiet for a moment. And you'd run it. I'd help build it. She looked at her notes on the table, the clean, specific documentation of Cairo's final assessment. Someone who understands the clinical side and the documentation side and why both of them matter. She paused. Bledsoe has offered to host the regional pilot program here, which would let me stay at Harwick while the framework is built. He was quiet for a longer moment. Then, they should have listened to you 6 years ago. Yes. She said it the way she'd said it before, plainly, without bitterness, because bitterness required energy she had other uses for. But they're listening now. Garver nodded slowly. He looked at Cairo, who had shifted his weight and was now leaning very slightly against Raina's leg in the way dogs lean against people they've decided are worth leaning against. He never does that, Garver said. I know, she said. She didn't move away. The commendation arrived as a formal framed document 8 weeks after Vance had first shown her the draft, and it came with a brief, functional ceremony at the federal building in Delmont that Raina attended on a Wednesday afternoon in clothing she did not own a lot of and that she had borrowed from Bledsoe, who was approximately the same size and had better options. Vance was there. Osei drove down from Denver. Garver was there with Cairo on a loose lead because someone had made the decision to allow the dog to attend, And Reyna thought that was probably the most sensible decision that had been made in the entire federal process. There were other people, federal officials, a DoD representative, a person from the Veterinary Licensing Board who shook her hand with both of his and said something she didn't fully retain because she was looking at Cairo walking across the lobby floor without the limp. There were remarks, brief ones. The federal representative used language about investigative integrity and clinical excellence and the protection of animals in service to the nation. He said her name correctly, which she noted. He said that the investigation had been initiated by clinical observation that no bureaucratic structure had been able to suppress, which was one way to describe it and not an inaccurate one. She received the commendation with both hands and said thank you in a voice that was steady because she had decided it would be steady. And then she stood in the lobby with the framed document while people came and said things to her that she received with the specific grace of a person who has spent a long time being invisible and finds the opposite experience genuinely strange. Bledsoe came to stand beside her after most of the official conversations had finished. She looked at the commendation. "You're going to put that somewhere nobody can see it, aren't you?" "Probably," Reyna said. "At least put it somewhere you can see it." She thought about that. "Maybe." Bledsoe looked at her sidelong. "You're allowed to acknowledge it." "I'm acknowledging it." "You're tolerating it." Reyna almost smiled. "I'm doing both." Vance found her near the exit when the lobby had mostly cleared. She looked like she had been awake for most of the previous night, which Reyna suspected she had. "The DoD framework meeting is scheduled for the third week of next month," she said. "They want clinical input in the first session. I'll be there." "I told them you'd lead the clinical component." Reyna looked at her. "You should have asked me first." "I know," Vance said. "I was confident." It was the closest thing to humor she'd heard from Vance in 3 months, and Reyna let it land the way it was meant. "Send me the pre-meeting documents when they're ready." "Already done." Vance paused. She looked at Reyna with the steady, measuring attention she'd first used in a storage unit in Mesa Vault, standing in front of a filing cabinet while a truck moved through the parking lane outside. "You were patient," she said. "I didn't have another option." "Most people find other options." She paused. "Anger, surrender, rewriting the story until it's something easier to live with." She held her gaze. "You just held it for 6 years." Reyna thought about what to say to that. About the winter night in the car outside the storage unit. About the monthly fee she'd paid because she couldn't bring herself to stop. About all the ordinary mornings of arriving at Harwick and doing the work and not talking about the filing cabinet and knowing that the knowing was its own weight and that she was carrying it anyway because the alternative was to put it down. And she had never found a way to put it down that didn't feel like giving something away she wasn't willing to give. "I kept seeing the dogs," she said. It was the same thing she'd said in the storage unit on the first day. It was still the most accurate answer. Vance nodded. She didn't add anything because nothing needed adding. 6 weeks after the commendation ceremony, a retired military working dog named Hector came through the front entrance of Harwick Veterinary Medical Center on a Tuesday morning in May, brought in by a retired handler who had noticed something he couldn't name, a subtle change in the way the dog was moving, a hesitation on stairs that hadn't been there before. The dog was 7 years old, Malinois and Shepherd Cross. Recently transitioned from a military installation in Utah to civilian care with his handler, cleared for transfer by a new evaluation contractor that had been certified under the reformed DoD oversight framework that was 8 weeks into its operational phase. Reyna was at the intake station when they came in. She watched Hector walk across the lobby floor, tracked his gait, his weight distribution, the way his right rear leg moved through the swing phase. She watched the slight, almost imperceptible shortening of the stride on that side. She watched the way his handler's attention was fixed on her face rather than on the dog, reading her the way handlers read clinicians, looking for the response before the words. She came around the counter and crouched to the dog's level. Hector looked at her. He did not approach immediately. He assessed her the way working dogs assess people, reading her movement, her energy, the quality of her stillness. Then he took 2 steps forward and allowed her to run her hand along his right flank. She felt what she expected to feel, a subtle tension in the musculature, the beginning of a compensatory pattern that was still early enough to interrupt. "When did you first notice the hesitation on stairs?" she said. "About 3 weeks ago," the handler said. He was watching her closely. The evaluation at the new facility came back clean. I didn't want to push it, but he stopped. But you know your dog, she said. Yeah. He paused. You're Taft? She looked up at him. I read about the Cairo case, he said. When I saw who was listed as the clinical coordinator for the oversight program, He stopped again. I wanted to bring him here specifically. She stood. She looked at Hector, who was still watching her with the calm, evaluative attention of an animal that was making a decision about whether someone could be trusted. Let's get some imaging, she said. Full series, including lateral hip and shoulder views. She looked at the handler. And tell me everything you've noticed, not just the stairs, everything. He started talking. She listened. Behind her, through the open door of the main clinic, she could hear the ordinary sounds of Harwick continuing, a phone ringing, cartwheels on tile, Bledsoe's voice from the far end of a hallway giving instructions to a technician. The sounds of a place that kept going regardless of what else was happening, that absorbed consequence and crisis and continued because the work didn't stop when the drama resolved. The work was the point. It had always been the point. She had spent years in rooms where being the person nobody looked at had felt like a diminishment, a verdict on her value delivered not through any single confrontation, but through the accumulated, ordinary dismissals of a system that had looked at her credentials and her role and decided what she was allowed to know. She had carried that verdict around for longer than she should have, checking it against her own understanding, finding every time that the verdict was wrong, and every time being unable to make the people who had issued it listen long enough to revise it. She understood now, had understood, in the way that slow knowledge becomes permanent, across the weeks since the sentencing, since the commendation, since the morning she had watched Cairo walk down the hallway without the deep, hiding limp, that the verdict had never been about her. It had been about what she represented to the people who issued it, the possibility of being seen, of having the gap between the official record and the actual truth made visible by someone who had the skill to read both. Systems that run on the distance between the official record and the truth are systems that need the Raina Tafts of the world to stay quiet. They need the person in the corner of the room to accept the furniture category. They need the filing cabinet to stay locked in the storage unit where it can be forgotten. What they cannot survive is a person who simply refuses to forget, not out of anger, not out of ideology, out of the specific, durable conviction that what she could see was real, and that real things, recorded carefully and held patiently, do not disappear just because a system insists they should. Hector pressed his nose briefly against her hand. She looked down at him. "Come on," she said. "Let's see what you're carrying." She led him toward the imaging room, and the handler followed, and the door swung closed behind them. And outside in the parking lot, the Maylight was doing what Maylight does in Colorado, bright and direct and completely indifferent to anything that wasn't right in front of it. Raina Taft had spent 6 years being the person nobody saw. She had kept records. She had waited. And when the moment came, when a dog with a hidden fracture walked into her clinic and looked at her and recognized something in her stillness, she had not needed anyone to tell her what to do. She already knew. She had always known. The only thing that had ever been required of her was the refusal to pretend otherwise.